Hello, good evening. Coming to you from central London. And today we have the top questions that landlords are asking for 2025. And I'll tell you, it's been a busy one because we had a webinar just a few days ago, and the amount of questions that we've had by buy-to-let investors have been a long list. So today we're going to be diving in. It's not only about renters' rights bill, it's just an overview of a number of questions from the renters' rights bill that's going to be coming into place at some point in the next few months, to EPC regulations, to tax changes, and the list goes on and on. So we're going to be diving in some questions that have been asked throughout the last few days, and also any questions that you may have online. Please feel free to ask. This is what this live is about. It's supposed to be interactive Q&A, and hopefully I'll be able to shed some light on some of the questions that a lot of landlords have as we continue to go into 2025. So first things first is making sure that we get some housekeeping out the way. And I'd like to ask if there's anyone that can hear me, see me. That would be probably the very first thing that I want to do. So as anyone dives in, please do let me know if you can hear me. Okay, great. Jonathan, good to have you on. So, as I said, today's question and answer time. Now, one of the things that have been asked the most is about rents, and are they increasing? Are they going down? Are they slowing down? What exactly is happening with rents as we've entered 2025? I think it's safe to say that the boom, and every boom, of course, I wouldn't necessarily say it has a bust, but every boom has an end. And I think it's safe to say in many areas of the UK, in comparison to what we saw in the last 3 years, we're definitely starting to see a slowdown. And just to make this clear, this is a slowdown in rental rates, not necessarily rentals going down. And at the back of that, of course, we see more properties on the market. And again, this is within the context of comparison to the last couple of years. I think we're entering into a more normal market of what we have seen sort of prior to the pandemic. So one article I wanted to share with you on this same topic was with regards to the landlord today, and this is renewed tenancy rents soar, but new let rents stagnate figures. Okay, cool. So we have the average new rent last month was only 1.8% compared to 12% to 12 months ago. The slowest rate growth since October 2020. Of course, that was the year of the pandemic, and that's the verdict from lettings agencies, Hamptons, which says that this is the 18th consecutive month that the rental growth has slowed, leaving the average tenant moving home in Britain paying £1,300 a month. And of course, if you're based in London, that's going to be more around about £2,300 if we look at London in general. Prime London, however, you're probably going to be just below the £3,000. So meanwhile, tenants renewing a contract continue to see rents rise much faster than tenants moving into new properties. So let me repeat that. Meanwhile, tenants renewing a contract continue to see rents rise much faster than tenants moving into new properties. The average rent for a tenant renewing their contract rose 6% across Great Britain over last year, more than 3 times faster than rent agreed on newly let property. This brings the average rent at renewal to £1,263 per month. That's £109 per month less than the tenant signing a new contract. So landlords continue to increase rent paid by existing tenants in order to close the gap with the value achieved if a new tenant were to move into the property. So I'll repeat that. Landlords continue to increase the rent paid by existing tenants, so the renewal, in order to close the gap with the value achieved if a new tenant were to move into the new property. So obviously, you guys are looking at the comparables. You're looking at what's fair value. If you're smart, you'll obviously keep the rental just below that market value to keep existing tenants, especially if they're being good tenants, paying on time, which is what you would expect from them, looking after the property, being responsive, and so forth. And a lot of people do ask me, but Danny, what's fair for an existing tenant? I always say anything around about 10%. Now, there are those fortunate landlords that give up to 20% discount of market value. And that's great, but and not so great depending on what you want to do with your property, at least short term, if you're doing that. But I won't dive in too much into that. And yet, not every landlord's fortunate enough to do that. So, with the exception of Scotland, where there are caps on rent hikes within a tenancy, every region saw renewal rents rise more quickly than for tenants moving into new property. Despite this, in recent years, sitting tenants have generally seen rents rise more slowly than tenants who moved home. Over the last 5 years, tenants renew a contract have seen rents rise by 26%. Wow. So again, over the last 5 years, tenants renewing a contract have seen rents rise by 26.5%. And that isn't unusual because rents have increased more than 30% across the border. So this compares to a 34% increase for homes where a new tenant moved in. There you go. So London has the widest gap in the country between rent increases for tenants moving into a new property, actually down 0.7%, and renters renewing contracts up to 6.8%. This is the second month in a row that London recorded year-on-year falls in rental growth, with average rents on newly let home down on the same 12 months ago. So this is a long article. Before I continue to go through this, I am going to share with you, and let me bring this up. I do want to share with you the questions that I've been asked around sort of rental. Now, when it comes to London, what I have seen again is properties on the market for much longer than what they were, let's say, a year and a half, 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, you put a property in the market, it wouldn't last 24 hours. Right now, it's pretty much typical to see a property on the market for a week or two, and perhaps even others, depending on the specific neighborhood, even longer. Because let's not forget that property is hyper local. So what's happening in a neighborhood in, let's say, in the borough of Camden can be very different as to what's happening in a neighborhood in the borough of Westminster. So it is hyper local, so there can be those different elements there. But overall, it's safe to say that properties are on the market a little bit more, and that landlords may experience some void periods, but it wouldn't be much. We're not in a market where it's a tenant's market and rental prices are going down, and tenants have the upper hand. I'll say still landlords still have a lot of power when it comes from the market point of view, from a rental price. And I've had people ask me, Danny, based on what's happening with the rent right now, which is slowing down, and based on the renters' rights bill, does it still make sense to, let me just have a look here. Does it still make sense to have a buy-to-let property? And it's a question that's been very popular for us. So in a nutshell, will the renters' rights bill and the current renter situation, will it kill the buy-to-let market? And the answer is no. And the answer to that, the reason for that is quite simply is supply and demand. Currently, there continues to be much more demand than what there is supply. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. We're in February, and February tends to be a very slow market in comparison to other months of the year. I always say this to landlords. Landlords tend to think that December, November is a slow month, are slower months, and they are when you compare them to the summer months, at least here in London. And yet, when it comes to January, especially February, it can be very slow. So we're now entering into spring in the next few weeks. That typically is a busy period, and especially as we come into the summer months, it tends to be very, very busy. Now, when I speak to property professionals and we look at the data and we look at the stats, that supply and demand isn't going to change drastically, at least not short term, and perhaps not even midterm. And the reason for this is that there isn't enough supply of properties. Now, that may change on a longer term, and it's not going to change perhaps from the accidental or the smaller buy to let landlords. It's going to change because of corporate landlords. And I believe that is the strategy that the current government has, which is that corporate landlords will fill that in. And when I say corporate landlords, what I mean by that specifically is the build to rent market, which is, I mean, if you look at any major city in the UK, you can see the scaffolding, you can see the buildings, you can see the regeneration of different neighborhoods, and you can see that going on again and again in different neighborhoods. We definitely see that here in London, and it's a segment of the market that's growing very, very rapidly. One thing to be said about those build to rent, of course, they do target the higher earners and also students. If you want to check out a video that we did based on that, feel free to go and look at. If you're not subscribed to the YouTube channel, go and look at that. Some fascinating data there. So that is some of the questions that we've been getting with regards to the rental buy to let. Is it still worth it? And so forth. So the important thing here is that landlords do need to adapt. Buy to let continues to be worthwhile, but if you're not adjusting and you're not adapting, then you may as well just exit the market because you're not going to be viable. It's not going to be financially viable for you. So, and I certainly see a lot of landlords that are not selling up, especially those professional landlords who have a handful of properties or more. Those are the ones that have probably a couple of properties and have it on their personal name, then that may be slightly different. I mean, I'll give you an example. I had several calls today from landlords, and this was at the back of the webinar, had many questions. And some of the questions were about taxes. And by the way, just a disclaimer here, this is in no way legal advice for landlords and certainly not financial advice. But a lot of landlords asking advice with regards to how they go about changing their personal, the property that they hold, that they have on their personal name, how they go about changing it and putting it into a business, a limited company. And we can see a lot of that. In fact, if we know that a buy to let in limited companies grew substantially. I think it was in 2023, between 2023 and 2024. It was an interesting article. I'm going to try and pull this up here. Let me have a look. Investing in a limited company. Why did I don't know? Okay, I can't seem to find this, but it was an interesting article I want to share with you where it shows a substantial amount. Most new buy-to-let purchases are now made. Oh, here you are. Here's a November one. This is an interesting article to sort of put my point of this gentleman who called me today asking with regards to moving his personal property that he had into a limited company. So here we are. So we've got last month, this was back in October 2024, so 3 months ago. So last month saw 5,300 new limited companies set up on a hold to hold on buy-to-let property across Great Britain. Hampton's analysis company's house data shows that the figure now stands at 28%. That's 28% higher than the previous September 2023 record. Now, it also represents the third highest monthly figure on record following 5,854 set up in April 2024 and 5,442 in February 2024. Again, I'll repeat that. Following the 5,854 set up in April in 2024 and the 5,442 in February 2024. Now, if you are scratching your head wondering why this is important and why people are incorporating. And you're quite new to buy to let. So we had the previous chancellor under the Conservative Party, George Osborne, came out with a great idea, according to him, and he phased out the ability for landlords to be able to um, put their mortgage interest as an expense for their business. So, in other words, in a nutshell, landlords are now taxed, and this was phased out between 2017 and 2020, I believe. Landlords are now taxed on their turnover instead of profit. And you don't see this in any other business, but Conservative Party, and I know we have a lot of people have a very strong opinion of the Labour Party right now. But we gotta be honest. Both governments haven't necessarily been very landlord friendly. And the reason this was done was that they wanted to level out the playing field between homeowners and landlords from a tax perspective, at least. So that is the reason as to why now. So you're saying, okay, how does this tie into corporate? Well, if you incorporate, you can offset those expenses as an expense because it is an expense. You can offset your mortgage interest as an expense if you have a limited company. Now, the challenge that a lot of landlords are now having is that if you have it in your personal name, it's now going to cost you a fair amount of money from a tax perspective to change your property that you have on your personal name into a limited company. How do you get around that? Well, that's a great question, and that comes to the conversation I was having with the landlord this afternoon. And the best thing I can advise is that you speak to a tax expert. And what I'll do is I'll make sure that my admin, who is online, adds a link to a referral system that we have where we can refer you to the right tax expert that we have. And we have a couple we work with, which are great, and we'll be able to help you with that information. So those are a couple of questions there. Now, I know that there are a few other questions which I'm going to try and go through each one of them as I go through this live video. So first up, we've got Jonathan. What changes should student landlords anticipate with the introduction of this legislation? Great question. So when you say introduction of legislation, Jonathan, I'm assuming you're talking about the Renters' Rights Bill. And with regards to this, we do know in terms of you being able to give notice to your tenant, that's going to change entirely. And there is one specific, because just as a recap, we're entering into the Renters' Rights Bill, whereby the normal tenancies by default will enter into a periodic tenancy. Okay, it doesn't matter whether you have a student, working professional, or whatever that may be. However, the government is introducing one caveat to that, and that is that if your property is a HMO, and you have a student and you can prove that they are students, so it can't just be part-time students or anything like that. So full-time students, you could prove that they're full-time students, you will have some type of vehicle to be able to keep that within a certain time frame of the year. And that's a sensible move from the government because that ensures that students won't be vulnerable. However, there are a lot of landlords that feel that the government hasn't gone far enough. But one issue with that as well, if you've been following the government's rules and the proposals, is that if you are going to benefit from that, or you are going to be under the student let, then you will have to be able to enter into the tenancy no later than 6 months from when the tenancy starts. So I'm not sure if I articulated that very well, but I'll put that on a comment. But in a nutshell, what I'm saying is, let's say, for example, the tenancy that you want to start with this student starts in September. You can't grant that tenancy in January. You have to wait until around about April to be able to, or March, to be able to benefit from this from being able to give notice to your students. I hope that makes sense. So what else do we have here? We got Edmund. Would you be able to help with my concern once the rental rights bill is enacted? Will I still have the ability to raise rents? Great question. So the answer to that is yes, you do. It's just going to be more formal. At the moment, we have something called the Section 13, which is a vehicle that we use to increase rents. It's very rarely used, to be honest with you, by landlords, but with agents, this is the formal document that we use. This is now going to be a standard document you need to use to be able to increase the rent for your tenant. Let me just bring this up here. So, the other thing to look out for, and I had shared this on one of my previous videos, is that currently under the current rules, tenants can apply to the first tier tribunal to dispute an increase on rent. Okay. And what's different coming into the renters' rights bill is the same thing. They can still dispute it. The key difference here is that currently, if it's taken to a tribunal and the tribunal judge decides actually it's a fair rent increase, Mr. Landlord, you can go ahead. And that was the Section 13 was implemented 2-3 months ago, then it can be backdated, whereby the tenant will have to pay the rent when it was increased 3 months ago, whatever difference, Mr. Tenant, you're going to have to pay because this is a fair rent. Moving forward with this renters' rights bill, it can no longer be backdated. So, if a tenant disputes the rent increase and feels it's not fair, takes it to a tribunal, a couple of months goes past, the tribunal says absolutely this is a fair rental increase. It starts from today, even though the landlord actually put it through 2 months ago. And that brings a question, why? What's the incentive of the tenant? I mean, the tenant. Why would the tenant not dispute it if he can or she can buy themselves an extra few months from this rental increases? And if that's the case, then I think that the the tribunals are going to be overwhelmed by tenants just making these applications. Let me know what your thoughts are on this anyway. On that same note, from a rental point of view, I've been asked from quite a few landlords as well when it comes to the end of the rental bidding wars, as per the government's wording, and what that means as well from an increased rent. Well, talking about increased rent, one of the things that I anticipate this year is that rents will increase more than what a lot of professionals had anticipated. And the reason for this is quite simply when it comes to the end of the the end of rental bidding wars. This means that if I put a property up here in London, I think it's worth £3,000, but maybe a little bit more. I can do that right now, and then I find out whether it's worth a little bit more by the amount of demand and viewing requests I get on this property, and then subsequently offers. And if that's the case, then it'll probably end up around about 3-2. If I no longer could do this, I don't want to leave money on the table, and therefore, if I think that my property is worth 3 grand, maybe a little bit more, I'm going to put the property on the market for 3.5 grand, because I want to have peace of mind that if it's too high, well, I'll just adjust it rather than thinking it was too low and I can no longer accept, because this is what the law would do. You can no longer accept a penny more than the price that you've advertised. So that's where we see those rental increases. So to answer your question, yes, you can increase the rent. You cannot increase it more than you cannot increase it more than 12 months. So as an example, if your tenancy starts on the 1st of January 2025 and you increase it in January 2026, you cannot increase it then on February or March of 2026. which I don't see many landlords increasing rent every 3 to 6 months anyway. So I don't see any difference on that regulation there. So what else do we have here? When is the Renters' Rights Bill Act expected to come into effect? So I'm going to take you from an optimist point of view and a pessimist point of view. Okay. So those landlords who are optimistic believe it's going to be at the end or the third quarter of this year, meaning around about October. Those are the optimists and optimistic landlords. And then you got the pessimistic landlords who think that this can happen as soon as April and even May this year. The reality is, I think it's going to be towards the end of spring this year. It's moving very quickly, and the one of the biggest questions here as well is what's going to happen with Section 21 as well, and what are my rights? I can't get my property back. So on that same question, what I will share with you is they are expanding the grounds. I believe it's ground 8, and you will have the ability to have access to your property again, depending on certain situations. So, for example, if you're selling your property, if you need your property to go and live in that property yourself, family members. So there are grounds whereby you can get possession of your property back again, if it's no fault, of course, of the tenant themselves. However, one thing to point out is there is a protection period for those tenants. So if it's no fault of the tenants themselves and it's because you want the property back, there is a protected period of about 12 months that you cannot apply to get possession of your property. So that has quite a few landlords nervous because, of course, it's just peace of mind. Things changes in your financial situation that you get your property back. Well, those are things that you need to make peace with because legislation is changing, and that's just reality of what's happening in the industry right now. So I'm lurking says more monkey business. Good to have you on. Looking okay. So we've got would be great to know about the new requirements for addressing property hazards like damp and mold. Well, we haven't got the full scope of that right now. I think I might have, let me have a look here. Yeah, I'd need to circle back to you because I don't have enough information with regards to that. And perhaps as the Renters' Rights Bill continues to progress, I could probably come back to you on that, Sonia. But I do know that there are going to be some new regulations when it comes to that and holding landlords more accountable for those modes. I mean, if you're a landlord and you've been a landlord for a while, you know that mold I'll say most cases. I mean, some of the cases, of course, it's the landlord's responsibility, and it might be that damp that's penetrated within the brickworks. But most of the mold that I see here in London is the cause of the tenant not ventilating the area as it should be. So whether that be in a bathroom and not turning on the fan, the kitchen, the same thing. You have an extractor in most cases, at least, to avoid any condensation. That being said, it's also sensible to open windows. That type of thing avoids sort of that mold and damp building up. But unfortunately, some tenants don't do that. So more monkey business. Can you increase your rent when there's major work going on at the property? I mean, you can increase your rent. I mean, if you have major works in your property, I'd assume you don't have any tenants. So as long as it's market value, you can increase the rent. Absolutely. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're renting your property at the moment for £1,000 and it's really odd looking property and you invest tens of thousands of pounds, make the property look amazing, and now if you compare it to market value, it's now worth 2.5 grand. That's fine. You increase it from 1,000 to 2.5 grand. There are no tenants in there. That's completely fine for sure. So we've got Steve and James. Are there any changes to the rent review clauses and fixed term tenancies? Whoa, Great question. So when it comes to rent reviews, you can no longer add a rent increases to the tenancy agreement. That's going to be abolished. There's going to be no rent increases incorporated into the tenancies. Now, one question I've been asked a lot is with regards to um, the rent increases, um, and with regards to the tenancy, what tenancy are we going to be using moving forward then if the short hold tenancy agreement is going to be abolished? And the answer to that is I don't know. And I haven't spoken to anyone that can give me a clear answer. This is something we're still waiting for. What is going to be that default tenancy that the government perhaps is going to introduce? Um, I'm dying to see what this may look like. So the clear answer to that is I don't know. From that same point, with regards to rent increases. Can you increase it? Can you not increase it? Yes, you can. Section 13. Can you include it in your tenancy? No, you can't. And will Labour government bring rent controls? Well, Angela Rayner and Matthew Pennicourt have made it clear that they won't bring in those rent controls. So, can they sort of go back on their words? Well, that's remained to be seen. But at the moment, they've made it very clear they are not going to bring any rent controls right now. So let's see what other questions we have here. So we've got Kaylee, Danny, as a landlord, will be obligated to allow pets in my rental property. The answer is no. So first of all, let's remember that when it comes to the request of pets, it really is not based on applicants. So it doesn't necessarily give applicants the right to have pets, although you can't discriminate against that. It is the tenant side. So tenants are the one that have the right to request pets, and you cannot unreasonably decline that request. Now, what is reasonable and what's unreasonable? Well, first of all, let's say that you have a head lease that doesn't allow pets. If it's a fair reason why the head lease doesn't allow pets, then you can just you have to respect the head lease, and therefore that's a reasonable reason to decline. There again as well, let's say your tenant lives in a very small studio flat. There I say, a 280 square foot. That's very small. And they want to have a 50-kilo Rottweiler and bring it into the property. That's a reasonable reason to decline that type of request, right? And also, I believe there's some type of insurance that if the tenant does decide to bring in a pet, then you would be able to sort of insist on some type of insurance. But we're still gathering that information as to what that actually looks like. Let me bring this up. Cool. So we have another question here. How might these new regulations influence that overall rental market and landlord confidence? I mean, we've already seen confidence from those smaller landlords decrease. A lot of landlords exiting the market. When I say smaller landlords, I mean those landlords have one or two properties. Those accidental landlords who didn't set out to have a property, perhaps inherited the property, got divorced, and ended up with a property. It could be for different reasons. Those type of landlords have decided to exit the market. It's just not financially viable. But what we have seen actually is a lot of confidence come back into the market, especially in the last few weeks and months. So confidence is actually up when it comes to professional landlords. Professional landlords being who? Well, those landlords who have 5+ properties are definitely scaling. And in fact, you know what? Let me share with you an article. I don't have the article specifically with regards to the confidence, and there was some stats on that. But this is an interesting article to kind of reinforce the reason why there's confidence in the market, and it's partly as well because of mortgage products. So there's a huge amount of mortgage products. Landlords are spoiled for choice right now, and of course, with that comes competition. That competition means that landlords can shop around for better mortgage rates. What we have here is rental yields hit a 13-year high in steady upward trend. Landlord rental yields reached their highest level since March 2011 in Q4 last year. Data from Paragon Bank has shown. So when you have these type of numbers, that drives a degree of optimism. Okay. Now, the word I continue to hear from property investors is definitely cautious optimism. Okay. So there's definitely no boom. Don't misinterpret what I'm saying. Okay. But rental yields here at 13 high in steady upward trend. Landlord rental yields reached their highest level since 2011. So what do we have here? So rental yields achieved by landlords reached an average of 6.9% in December 2024, the highest level since February 2011, when the figure stood at 7.12%. And to drive something as well here, guys, is here in the capital. Prior to 2019 to 2020, so during the pandemic, I found it very challenging and even very rare to find yields that would be around above 5%. And the last couple of years, I've seen the average yield here in London easily hitting 5.5%, and I'm even seeing 6%, which is unusual for the capital. So that just goes to show in terms of the property price in London has been flat and remains flat for quite a few years, hasn't done much, and yet the rent has increased substantially. So it suddenly makes London for quite a few people who just really, the capital wasn't a good investment in comparison to the north. Actually, now suddenly London seems to be quite attractive to quite a few buy-to-let investors. And of course, you have that capital growth that London can take long, because that's just what London does. It can be flat for a number of years, but always delivers. It could take longer than expected, but it does come by. Okay, so going back to this article, the figures based on Paragon Bank's offered data show that the high follows an increase. Let me reduce this a little, from 6.7% at the end of the third quarter in 2024, and represents growth of 30 BPS rise since the same period of 2023. This is a trend that has continued since midway through 2022, with house price inflation stabilizing while rents continue to rise, fueled by an imbalance between supply of privately rented homes and tenant demand. And as I said, this isn't going anywhere soon. So therefore, when I'm asked about the buy-to-let, is it still worthwhile? Is it still viable? As long as this imbalance continues, yes. And it is set to continue, at least for the short to mid-term. So region by region, the highest yields, 8%, were achieved by landlords with properties in Wales, followed by the North and the Southwest with 7.75%. Landlord properties in Greater London showed lower yields at almost 5.5%. And by property type, houses in multiple occupation, HMOs, generated the highest yields of 8% plus. And then we have followed by freehold blocks of 7.2% and flats at 6%. Paragon Bank Mortgage Commercial Director Russell Anderson said, a 13-year high in average rental yields is evidence of the market being in a much better health than some would have you believe. And we have the media to thank for that, of course. And where landlords invest strategically purchasing in areas where homes are relatively affordable and targeting more complex property types buy-to-let delivers strong returns. A key component of this demand, something that has outstripped the supply of privately rented homes for some time. This has caused markets rents to rise, which in turn has helped to sustain strong yields. While yields are a good indicator of the regular income that landlords will typically to get complete picture of the returns an investment property can generate, we must also take into account aspects such as how they finance. And of course, that is a big factor. Mortgage rates are lower than what they were last year, and yet certainly higher than what they were prior to 2021. So borrowing money continues to be expensive. So, going back to this article and to the same question, does it still make sense? Yes, an article and there was a research done as to why this was, and it was based on 4 factors. Number one, property continues to be a tangible investment. Okay, what does that mean? Well, it means that there is flexibility with property. You can have property on a short let, you can have property on a corporate let, you can have property on a long-term rental, you can move into the property. There's different things you can do. For example, you buy shares. What can you do with shares? Absolutely nothing. You just have to wait and sit and wait for it to increase. So there is that flexibility. There's also the fact that a lot of landlords and investors like that they can pass it on to their children. So there is this aspect of generational wealth that can be created through property. And there was just this preference to property in comparison to other investments. There was another one, but it doesn't come to mind. It will come to me at some point, I promise. So, what else do we have here? We have wise property process. How might these regulations influence the overall rental market and landlord confidence? I hope I answered that question to you, wise process. So there is confidence is up, but of course, mortgage rates is probably the biggest factor, and also just the general cost. Again, I love to look at research. I haven't got it in front of me, but landlords by far have indicated that the cost of maintenance property and new regulations is by far the biggest threat to their buy-to-let business. Great. So I don't see any further questions here. So this was just giving you a recap as to what was happening in the market, but specifically also the questions that we're getting a lot. There was one last question that was put through to me before I came into the live, and it was regards to selective licensing. And this is a big one, guys, because if you're not aware of what selective license is and why it's so sensitive right now, the simple answer is because prior to December 2024, the councils had to get permission or for authorization from the Secretary of State to be able to implement selective licensing within their borough and a neighborhood. Now, since December 2024, that's been removed. Now, councils, all they need to do is launch a 10-week consultation. That's 10-week consultation. And guess how that consultation always ends up? It ends up being that actually it is a good idea to have selective license in a particular neighborhood. Of course, all the questions, the consultation is geared to make this to make it an approval, and it is approved. So since that's happened, what we've seen is there's been a number of councils that have applied, that have launched the consultation because they intend to now have selective licensing to all the borough or to certain neighborhoods. And landlords don't find out about this if they're not looking for the selective licenses. So landlords need to be aware of this. They need to be aware that they need to go into the council wherever they have their property or their properties and find out whether there's a selective license launched within their neighborhood. I spoke to one landlord today. He was not aware. And this is one of the things that I love about providing this content and the live videos that we do and the webinars, which, by the way, we'll add on the link as well for you not to miss the next one, because by far the one we did last week was the most attended webinar that we've done since we started a year and a half ago. And this goes into depth. Okay. And on the next one that we're going to have some experts join us. So, pitch out of the way. This landlord felt he dodged the bullet because he had no idea. And this is what really, I find these videos so rewarding when I know that a landlord has dodged the bullet, because most landlords I speak to, they're not bad landlords. They're just badly informed. They're ill-informed landlords, and they just need to educate themselves to make sure that they're keeping compliant. I'll share with you a story, which I've shared a few times before, and I'll end on this, okay? So this is a landlord investor who purchased a property in Gateshead. This was back in, I believe it was 2020 and or 2021, thereabouts, early 20s. And he purchased not one, but two properties in auction. This was around about April. Had to refurbish the property, built them up, got it onto place, and in summer the same year, managed to rent both properties. Now, in November, he was shocked by getting a letter from the council saying that his properties, not one but both, were in the selective license area. And he immediately applied for the selective license. Within 3 days, he immediately applied for it. And he said, here's my application. Well, he was fined anyway. The judge said, ignorance isn't an excuse. And to his defense, he was, well, I didn't know about it. My solicitor, when I purchased the property, didn't inform me. The solicitor from the vendor didn't inform me. The vendor himself didn't inform me. Well, again, ignorant isn't an excuse. And he was fined thousands and thousands of pounds. You don't want to find yourself in that situation. Okay, guys, thank you very much for joining me on a Wednesday evening. It's much appreciated. And again, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Wishing you a very good evening.